I've always been pretty fond of licensed board games. I may or may not even be working on a video about them. I've played a whole bunch of them, and it's permanently tainted my mind. Whenever I'm playing a really good video game, I often find myself wondering what a board game adaptation would be like. Sometimes I've been lucky to find that they already exist, like the Stardew Valley board game or the Cult of the Lamb board game, which is hopefully gonna finally be on Kickstarter soon. Other times, I just happen to stumble across the game, like me one day going, "Oh boy, Dead by Daylight has a merch shop. Oh boy, it has a collectibles section. Oh boy, it has a board game subsection. Oh boy, it's like $200 to get it and all of the expansions?" Luckily, I'm financially responsible and would never... Wait, you get minis of all of the characters? Anyway, tangents aside, unfortunately not every video game makes its way onto the tabletop. Some come from small indie companies that don't have the time, money, or people to do stuff like that, and some devs just probably don't care to do it. It's not a very high priority of theirs, and that's fine. Whatever the reason, a game I recently found out didn't come with a paper variant was BUCKSHOT Roulette. You might remember it from when it was everywhere for a while. I fully bought into the hype. I watched a million different YouTubers play the game and even found some awesome creators like Delightful Kissboy through their videos on it. I also bought the game myself and thoroughly enjoyed my time with it, although I have not played it in a while, so I'm actually not too familiar with things like the new items, the multiplayer mode, or whatever those hard mode pills were. Hard mode pills is probably not a great name for those.
Hey, so this is me from the future. I was just getting background footage for this, and turned out I knew that I didn't know a lot about stuff that had been added in the later updates, but I didn't realize how little I actually knew. So I get a lot of stuff wrong. I've opted to not go back and redo everything, both because I don't feel like it and because it doesn't really affect any of my decisions too much, but I just figured I'd mention I'm aware now that I get some things wrong about, I'll come back every time that I get something wrong and I'll correct myself. But I don't think it's that big of a deal. I don't think it matters too much, but I just wanted to address that I am aware that I'm a little stupid.
Sometimes with games like this, fans take it upon themselves to make their own games. Sometimes this is with the intent of providing the experience to everyone, like with TechDweeb's Cilantro, which is made to replicate Cilantro as a card game playable with just a standard card deck and a pad and pen. Or sometimes they make full-on board games with quality that you would pay $100 for and not walk away disappointed, but keep it for themselves, either for legal reasons or logistic ones, like Ditto Grain's obnoxiously cool homemade Hollow Knight board game that they made for their kids. Sometimes, though, they make it just for a one-off way to waste some time and introduce a friend to a cool game they like. But later, they realize that they can use the idea to make a YouTube video, and they rework the game from scratch to do exactly that. Some years ago, I was shooting the breeze with a friend of mine and happened to have some note cards, some dice, and a card deck on me. I'm the type of person who practically never leaves the house without at least a few games on hand, so this wasn't some crazy coincidence or premeditated plan or anything. Boredom struck, and we decided to pass the time with a game. And I had been really into BUCKSHOT Roulette at the time, so I asked if he'd like to try and make our own card game of it, and we proceeded to do exactly that. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was fun enough, and it laid the groundwork for what I'll be doing today, making a better version of a BUCKSHOT Roulette card game. Also, to address the elephant in the room, I had already come up with a bunch of ideas for this before I even considered looking up if it had been done already, and found that at least one person on Reddit had indeed made their own homemade BUCKSHOT Roulette card game and laid out in detail how to play. I've opted to not read that post, mostly because of the risk that, if it turned out to be too similar to my ideas, I'd probably just have to scrap this video. So feel free to look for yourself, but you'll just have to take my word that any similarities between their ideas and mine are purely coincidental. If you've gotten this far and don't know what BUCKSHOT Roulette is, first of all, thanks for sticking this out, and secondly, in the base game of BUCKSHOT Roulette, you're sat in front of the dealer, with a shotgun in front of the both of you. You both have an equal amount of so-called charges displayed on a monitor next to you, which acts as your health. As the round starts, a series of shells are shown. Some are red live rounds, while others are blue blanks. The shells are randomly inserted into the gun, meaning that you know how many bullets there are, as well as the ratio of live to blank, but you have no clue of the specific order. You grab the gun and you fire it at either yourself or the dealer. Here, there's a little Punnett square of potential outcomes. If you shoot the dealer and it's blank, your turn ends and you pass the gun to the dealer. If you shoot the dealer and it's live, the dealer takes a damage, but your turn still ends after. If you shoot yourself and it's blank, you get another turn, but if you shoot yourself and it's live, you obviously take a damage and end your turn. Gameplay proceeds like this, back and forth until either the gun is empty, in which case it's reloaded with a new amount and ratio of shells, or someone dies. If that's you, the game ends. If it's the dealer, you either go to the next stage with both of you refreshing your lives, or you just win if it's the third stage. There's also items that can do a whole plethora of things, which I'll get more into later, but the important part is that you get more every time that the gun is reloaded, but can only hold up to 8. Also, you have to play them before shooting on your turn, and you can play as many as you'd like. So, the main things we need to adapt are pretty obvious, as the game is conceptually simple, but there's actually more to it than you may initially think. We need to start broad before nailing down details. Rather than a single-player experience like the video game, this is going to be a game for, ideally, 2 people, since I simply don't feel like making the items balance around 4 players. And making a solitaire version would seemingly involve creating a sort of simulated player, which is a lot of work. If this does well, I could make a solitaire variant, but that's for another day. Next, what is perhaps the most important part, the gun and its bullets. In my head, I was thinking of Faith when he's like, a gun with 1 bullet, but I didn't want to fully commit to doing the voice because I thought it would sound weird, but then I half committed, which sounded weirder. Anyway, I think my friend and I actually nailed this when we made our little mock-up out of note cards. We made 4 cards with live written on them, and 4 with blank. We also had 1 card that we simply drew a gun onto. Every time the gun gets reloaded, you roll 2 d4. The d4 need to be visually distinct, ideally a red and a blue, because one is going to represent live rounds and the other will represent blank rounds. Alternatively, you could just use 1 d4 and roll it twice, just make sure to clarify ahead of time if you're rolling lives or blanks first. Then assemble the chamber by shuffling the rolled amount of blanks and lives together. The gun card simultaneously acts as a turn marker and a target marker. Every turn, the player who has the gun card points it to either themselves or their opponent and reveals the top card of the deck. The consequences are pretty much exactly the same as the video game. Blanks either waste or grant a turn, lives cause the target to lose a charge. Oh, speaking of, the charge system hasn't been established, has it? We have a pretty major decision to make here. We can either have it be like the real game, where you go through a preset series of charge amounts, or we can set one amount that you always use, or randomize it by dice or something. Or, hear me out, we don't choose at all. I've personally always loved games that offer different ways to play, whether it be difficulty modifiers or suggested house rules or completely different game modes, so I want to do that here. Players can decide themselves how many charges they get. Personally, I think the default options should be the following. Story mode. Play the best 2 out of 3. On round 1, players start with 2 charges, round 2, 4 charges, and round 3, 6. Double or nothing. Roll a d4 and add 2. Both players have that many charges this round. I opted for the d4 plus 2 thing instead of a d6 because I feel like starting with 1 or 2 health and potentially dying on the very first round wouldn't be very fun. But if you disagree, you can absolutely change that. Roll a d100 for all I care. Have fun with it. Anyway, in base Buckshot, the story mode's 3rd round also features a unique mechanic where once the player or dealer reaches 2 charges, they lose the ability to heal. They also automatically die on their next hit after reaching 2, meaning that they can effectively also only have 5 charges, as after 4 damage they die in 1 hit. I've opted to exclude this mechanic because it seems a little out of place for a card game in my opinion, but it could absolutely work as a house rule for those looking for the most accurate possible experience. Last little detail on charges, while they could just be represented by spinning down a die or using any tokens you might have on hand, even just writing it on a piece of paper, I think the ideal solution would be to have both players take some double-sided tokens, probably lightning bolts to mirror the computer game, and then have them just be flipped over when they take damage. This way, players always remember what their starting health was, which is important when we talk about healing later on. This could also incorporate the special sudden death mechanic I mentioned a second ago. Just have 2 specialty tokens that, once they're the only ones up, initiate the final phase. I think that's the charges and core gameplay covered. There's some small details I couldn't fit here that I'll dive deeper into when we wrap everything up, but that was the big stuff figured out. Now, we just need to address one more big thing. The items. Just like the real game, before every reload of the gun, players will draw item cards. We'll get to see how many cards in a sec. If they reach 8 items, they stop drawing. Just like in the computer game, you may not discard items to make room if you draw a better one. If you want an item gone, you have to have used it in a round at some point. In Buckshot Roulette, the amount of items that you draw is consistent within a round, as in no matter how many times you reload the gun, you'll always draw the same amount of items. 0 for round 1, 2 for round 2, and 4 for round 3.
Hey, this is the first big thing that I got wrong. In the double or nothing mode, your items actually are randomized. Like, the amount that you get is randomized. I did not remember that. It's not like that in the base game, but in the double or nothing mode, it is. And like I said, didn't play this game when Double or Nothing was out. Played Double or Nothing for the first time today. So I did not know about that. That's my bad.
To account for this, we'll update the game modes as such. In story mode, on round 1 you'll draw no items, on round 2 you'll draw 2 items, and for round 3, 4. If you're playing double or nothing, before reloading the gun, roll a d4. Both players draw that many items. While I think rolling for the lives is pretty fun, I don't love it as much as the items. I think I would personally prefer to play a modified version where the lives are still random but the items are consistent within the round, which, like I keep saying, would be a totally valid way to play, because house rules are awesome. The hypothetical rulebook for this game would be more of a guide, but not necessarily one that you have to adhere to perfectly. So, with that out of the way, we need to tackle the item deck itself. First, I want to talk about how many of each item there should be in the deck. It's impossible to port over completely accurately without giving each player their own individual deck, which I just don't really want to do. The main problem is that if there's, say, 4 cigarettes and one player draws 4 cigarettes, then the other player just can't hope for any. Honestly, I can't think of a satisfactory way to remedy this. I could introduce item limits, which are a thing in the actual game, where you can only have X amount of a given item, but making someone continually discard and draw again until they find an item they're allowed to take just sounds unfun, and it still sends the card to discard where the other player still can't get it, unless they're made to shuffle every time a card is discarded, which would also suck. Overall, I just decided to not worry about it. Hopefully the randomness of the system will balance itself out. That being said, here is my idea. The deck will have 4 of every item, since in the actual game, you're supposed to always have an equal chance of getting anything. I thought about weighting certain items based on their in-game limit amounts, but after looking at some of the numbers, I didn't like that idea very much. Before players draw items, the discard is shuffled back into the draw pile. This admittedly might get tedious, but it does ensure that as long as it's not actively in front of a player, any card always has a chance to be drawn. This doesn't fully solve the item hogging problem, but it does help a bit, since as soon as a player uses an item that they were holding, it'll end up back in rotation rather than it being out of play until their deck runs out. However, I do think not shuffling until necessary, or potentially just not shuffling ever and letting items slowly dwindle, could be a fun variant if you don't mind item hoarding, or if you're playing with someone that you know won't do it. Now on to the fun part, actually porting over the items, except not so fast. I don't want to have to write a giant wall of text on some of the more stipulatory items, so we're going to establish some keywords and standardized formatting that'll help the readability of some items. It feels a little redundant because of how few items there are, but I tried drafting some descriptions for items without these, and it led to such a large disparity between some cards' descriptions being super long and others being barely a few words, that I thought this would be better overall. If a card says, regain X charges, if you have any charges flipped face down, flip up to X charges face up. Persists until will mean that this card remains in play until a certain condition is met, at which point it is discarded unless otherwise stated. 2 instances of the same persist until card cannot be assigned to the same target at the same time. Untouchable. This card cannot be stolen by any effects. This is only going to end up being put on one card, and it may not be necessary, but I figured it sounded better as a keyword than just writing "this cannot be stolen" on the card. It could just be me, though. Discard. Put a card into its appropriate discard pile without triggering effects. I probably didn't need to put this, but there's an item that involves discarding a bullet card, and I could see people unfamiliar with the game being unsure if the bullet still triggers or not, and I thought it was easier to just establish discard as a keyword than to specify that on the card. Shells refers to the live and blank cards collectively. The chamber refers to the deck with the shells in it. Any card that refers to interacting with the chamber refers to the top card of the deck unless otherwise stated, and cards always go back where you took them from, again, unless otherwise stated. Cards with bullet points indicate a series of potential outcomes. Each bullet will explain what happens according to what outcome. All cards target the person who played them unless they begin with targets X, denoting that the player needs to pick a target instead. There's some other stuff I'll get more into in the end overview, but that's the major aspects that I wanted to address. So now we're on to the actual fun part. Some items have pretty obvious solutions when it comes to porting them over, but some less so. I'll go over all the ones that I think have those obvious solutions, then go over some that I'm either undecided on or have zero clue what to do with. Cigarettes, regain 1 charge. Beer, discard a shell from the chamber. Magnifying glass, secretly view a shell from the chamber. Handsaw, targets the gun, persists until the gun is fired. On a live shell, the target takes 2 damage. On a blank shell, no effect. Adrenaline, untouchable. Take a card from the other player and play it immediately. Inverter, targets the gun. Persists until the gun is fired. Live shell, resolves as if it was a blank shell. Blank shell, resolves as if it was a live shell. There is technically an issue with the inverter because in-game, if you used the inverter and then used the beer, the inverter would just get wasted. But now in the card game, if you use the inverter and then use the beer, since inverter persists until the gun is fired, inverter would now proc on the next shell, which is technically inaccurate, but also why would you ever do that? So I don't think it's worth accounting for. But that leaves us with 3 items left to adapt, each of which comes with some of its own problems that I'll talk through here. Handcuffs seems simple, and it kinda is, but every way that I can think to phrase it just feels clunky. Let me explain how they work in the computer game first. You give them to the dealer, or vice versa, and they become handcuffed. Then, once they would start their turn, they instead skip it, granting you an additional turn. Then, at the start of their next turn, they break the cuffs and proceed as usual. That's the weird part to put into a card. The handcuffs persist for a while, even though they're not actually doing anything, and this is solely to prevent them from getting handcuffed twice back to back. In-game, this is easy to communicate, but in a card, it would have to be something like handcuffs targets a player, persists until discarded. First turn, target skips their turn. Second turn, target discards this card. It's not perfect, but I don't know how to do it better. I don't love the sort of circular nature of its discard condition being that it gets discarded. I just feel like there's a chance that someone unfamiliar with Buckshot would see this and not understand what it's trying to do, but I really don't have a better idea that doesn't involve adding more keywords or using tokens to track how long you've had it or something else overly complicated. Also, in case you were going to comment it, yes, I know that I could just explain in plain text what the card does. I could easily write, place this card in front of your opponent. They skip their next turn, and then they discard it the turn after that and take their turn as normal. You cannot give handcuffs to a player who already has them, but that just feels too word heavy. I'm trying to simplify things as much as I can. If you have a better idea, please feel free to let me know in the comments, but I'm probably going to stick with the one that I made. Expired medicine. This and the next item are both tough for similar yet opposite reasons. This one is because it relies on random chance, and I simply don't know what the chance is supposed to be. I spent a lot of time researching and can't find a satisfactory answer. In the digital version, expired medicine either heals you for 2 charges or deals you 1 damage, but it never explicitly mentions what the chances are supposed to be of either happening. I've seen some people claim that it's an even 50-50, and the description definitely seems to make it appear that way, but I've definitely seen some YouTubers go like 0 for 10 on it. I know that with random chance, things like that will happen, but it really feels weighted toward hurting you. Some people have also claimed that it's 60-40 in favor of the damage, which feels more accurate, but is harder to roll for without introducing yet another die. I'm going to compromise by making the odds just barely damage-sided, but if you're playing this yourself, feel free to decide the outcome however you feel is most appropriate. Expired medicine. Roll 2d4. 2 through 5, take 1 damage. 6 through 8, regain 2 charges. Burner phone. In Buckshot Roulette, the burner phone tells you the status of a random shell, i.e., third shell is a blank. It also can't be used when there's only 1 shell left, because at that point you should be able to deduce it yourself, and if you weren't keeping track, then tough taffy, I guess. The obvious problem here is accounting for randomness. Since the deck is always going to be changing size, we can't really just roll dice unless we use the denary dice. Was that what they're called? Denary? What's it called? The dice from the Curiosity box, where it's like a D1 through a D10. I could use those. I do own those. But I don't think it's fair to assume that everybody owns those. So without the denary dice, if there's only 3 bullets left, what do you roll? A D4 and just keep re-rolling until you get a valid number? I've never really been a fan of the roll and re-roll until you get X mechanic, because theoretically you could be there forever. I recently was playing a game where I was rolling a D6 and I had to re-roll until I didn't get a 1. And no joke, I rolled 6 1s in a row. It was hilarious, but only because it was in the setup, and would probably get annoying if I was just wanting to use my item. I had the idea of letting the other player choose where to cut the deck and show you that card, but that introduces foul play in the way of either purposefully showing or not showing the other player a certain card that you have information on. I also thought of having it linked to your remaining charges, like look X cards down where X is your remaining charges, but that still has issues with the deck getting too small, as well as removing the randomness of it. I also considered something involving shuffling the deck to get a random one, but then that interferes with other players' information. I also played with the idea of maybe it letting you look at the discarded cards in case you forgot what's been shot already, but then that makes the card useless as long as you just use your memory. And also, if you forget what the starting ratio was, then you basically have nothing to go on, so that idea sucked. I also don't want the player to get to choose which card because, again, randomness. I thought about letting them add an unused bullet, that way there's randomness in whether they draw a blank or live, and they do still get information, but while I think the concept would be fun to add as a different item, I don't think it fully honors the burner phone's concept. So, to recap, we need to adapt an item which tells you the status of a random shell, but cannot tell you the first or last shell, and will decide randomly regardless of the amount of shells in the chamber. It can tell you the next shell in the gun, just not what shell started on top, so if one shell's been fired, the current next shell is technically the second shell, since the burner phone refers to each shell by its starting position. This way, if you use it with 2 shells remaining, you'll always just read the top shell. Also, if you happen across multiple burner phones, you'll always get the same information every time, though this rarely comes up since you're usually limited to only having one. I've tried to be as faithful as possible when adapting these items, but I just don't see a way to fully adapt this one. I'm gonna have to compromise heavily. Here's what I came up with. Burner phone. Roll a d4 and look at the shell that many cards from the top of the chamber. If that shell is the final shell, or if there aren't enough shells in the chamber, instead look at the second shell from the bottom. If there's only one shell left, this item does nothing. What? I got something else wrong. Who could have possibly seen this coming? That's right, it's me from the future again. Turns out the burner phone can tell you the last bullet in the chamber. It seems like what it avoids is telling you the next bullet in the chamber, although I'm not 100% sure about that either. I had a few times where it told me the last bullet if I used it when there was 2 bullets in the chamber, and every time that I did it while there was 2 in the chamber, it would always tell me the last one, so it seems like it avoids telling you the next one, which makes sense because it doesn't want to just be the magnifying glass. So I kind of had this backwards, but I end up compromising a lot on how I designed the burner phone item anyway, so it doesn't really matter because, you know, the fact that it's inaccurate doesn't change. It was already inaccurate. It's definitely not perfect, but I don't hate it. I think there's a bit more text than I would like, but that's just what happens with an item that has this many stipulations. It also greatly increases the odds of you just reading the second to last shell, so it's not entirely random, but again, I really don't know what else I could have done about that. It was really hard to make this not just seem like the magnifying glass, but worse, which is a problem that I honestly think the burner phone suffers from in the base game anyway, but I also wanted to stay pretty faithful to the source throughout this and not reinvent more than I needed to. I'm trying to adapt Buckshot Roulette into a card game, not redesign Buckshot Roulette. And speaking of, that's Buckshot Roulette. I'm going to do one more little summary of how everything works, which will also address some smaller details that I couldn't find room to mention above, but we've done all of the work, so after that it's over. No outro. This video will end very abruptly. So if you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe while you can, and tell me in the comments what you would have done differently. If you didn't like it, you can consider disliking the video and tell me what put you off. And if you don't do any of those, thanks for sticking around this long, and maybe I'll get you next time. In Buckshot Roulette, the card game, 2 players will face off against each other, trying to correctly guess whether their gun is loaded with a blank shell they need to aim at themselves or a live shell to aim at their opponent. The consequences for guessing wrong can be deadly. To set up the game, the players should agree on what game mode they'll be playing. Story mode, a best 2 out of 3 mode with a preset amount of lives and items per round, or double or nothing, a chaotic variant where almost everything is decided by the rolls of dice. Players are also encouraged to experiment with their own house rules, maybe combining the game modes or inventing whole new ones with special modifiers. The possibilities are limitless. Once the players are ready to start the game, the first load up on items if they're included by the selected game mode. Items can do anything from healing you to giving you access to secret information about the state of the shells in the gun's chamber. No matter what method you use to decide how many to draw, whether it be a predetermined or decided by dice, you can never have more than 8 at a time. After items are assigned, decide starting health, referred to as charges. Again, this will either be predetermined or decided by dice, all according to the pre-established method. Just keep in mind that whatever the starting charges are, you will never be able to heal above it. Charges are obviously represented by the charge tokens, which are flipped face down to show when a player takes damage. Both players will always have the same starting health. Now, it's time to load the gun. Roll 2d4 or just 1d4 twice. Either way, make sure it's clear which die or which roll is assigned to blanks and which is assigned to lives. Take the corresponding amount of each card type and shuffle them together to form the gun's chamber deck. Leave this in the center of the table and re-roll the d4s so that the players cannot use them to remind themselves of how many of each shell are in the deck. They'll have only their memory to rely on for that. Choose a player to go first by whatever means you like. Maybe whoever would be the most likely to play buckshot roulette in real life gets to go first. However you pick, give them the gun card. They're about to take the first turn. The first thing you can do on your turn is use items. You can use as many as you like, but be aware that some items, like the handcuffs or the inverter, cannot be used multiple times by the same player. This will be denoted by the persists until keyword, which shows that a card is supposed to be assigned to a target, usually the gun or a player, and will stay with the target until the card's stated discard condition occurs. If a player wishes, they may freely discard a persists until item by trying to play it while another one is already on the table. Any other items are automatically discarded upon use and cannot be discarded without trying to trigger their effect. If, however, an item's effect can't trigger, like using the cigarettes when your health is already full, you can effectively freely discard them. Since you're still using the item, it just doesn't do anything. Once a player is satisfied with their item usage, they must aim the gun. They can aim it at themselves or their opponent. Once they've locked in one of these options, they must fire the gun. To do this, reveal the top card of the chamber deck. If it's a live shell, whoever it's pointed at takes damage and the active player's turn ends. If it's a blank shell, what happens depends on who the gun was aimed at. If the active player aimed it at their opponent, nothing happens and their turn ends. However, if they aimed it at themselves, they get to take another turn, starting back from the item phase. After the shell resolves, place it face down in a discard pile. Players may never look back through this discard pile. They must rely on memory to keep track of how many shells have been fired. Proceed in this fashion until a player runs out of charges or the chamber runs out of shells. In the case of the latter, redistribute items and reload the gun in the same manner as the setup. If a player runs out of charges, they die and lose the current round. And that's Buckshot Roulette, the card game. All you need is some dice and some note cards to make it yourself and get playing. Have fun!